Welcome to BCTV's Meet the Candidates. I'm Randy Holhut from the Commons, Windham County's independent source for news and views. And I'll be talking today with Brenda Siegel from Newfane, who is one of 4 Democratic candidates for governor in the August 14th primary. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a crowded field for the Democratic nomination. Certainly we haven't seen this many candidates running for some time now. Since the famous 2010 demolition derby of a primary with Peter Shumlin came out on top on. How is it like? How much trouble have you been having kind of differentiate your message from the other people you're running against, James Ehlers, Christine Hallquist, and Ethan Sonborn?
I think actually people have been, we're all very different people. So I think the message has been delivered differently. And also my plan has been a really well-formulated plans and platform for the state and vision. So I think that has really come across, as well as coming from a different place, which is just as regular working Vermonters. And that has been a really strong piece of what I bring to the table.
Well, and when you introduced yourself in your campaign statement, you said, quote, "I realize that I'm not reflected anywhere in our legislative body, and I want to change that. People in my position don't run for office because they don't have resources and supports that other people have." So how did you overcome that particular shortcoming?
You know, I decided that I was going to run anyways, and I think that the way that we handle money in politics only changes when we decide that it's going to change. It's only going to change when people vote for people who come from different backgrounds and vote for different voices. That's how our political system really changes, is when we decide we are not going to do it that way anymore, and it is time for new voices and new people to come to the table.
And certainly political activism on has been something that's occupied a lot of your time in the last couple of years since the 2016 election.
And really throughout my whole life, I've been very involved in issue-based politics. I interned for Bernie Sanders in my 20s in DC, and I volunteered in 6 states during the presidential campaign, and I've engaged wholeheartedly in issue-based advocacy in our state house in the last 5 or 6 years, but especially in the last 2 or 3 years.
Well, certainly with an issue that's very personal for you, and that you recently had made a major statement in your campaign for, and that's trying to figure out a way to deal with the opioid crisis, and doing it in a way that succeeds, as opposed to all the other methods that haven't.
Right. According to the Vermont Department of Health, the prescription-based opioid use has gone down. However, all other opiate-related use has gone up. So I don't think that what we've been doing is working. I think it's time for us to take a new approach. Other approaches have been used in other countries, and that has been a huge lifesaver, and also helps with the collateral damage associated with opiate use disorder in those countries.
And I know some of the remedies that you have suggested. It's a 4-point plan. Harm reduction is the one that gets a lot of controversy, because the idea, people get squeamish of saying, okay, here's your place to shoot up.
Yes.
Here's some clean needles, have at it.
So harm reduction saves lives, and we know that from what it has done in countries like Portugal and in Vancouver in Canada, and so we really have to embrace it, because if our goal is to save lives, to lower use, to get people into treatment, and to reduce the collateral damage like panhandling, theft, needles on the streets, then we have to be willing to embrace the best practices that work. With overdose prevention sites, which is what you just mentioned, I think that people have a fear because they're afraid that then people will be shooting up all over our state. And so my answer to that is that's what's happening all over our state right now. In every corner of the state, whether you know it or not, that is what's happening. And so what we're trying to do is create a situation where there is access to social workers, access to therapists, access to medically assisted treatment on demand, and access to safe practices, so that there's less death and more chances at lowering some of those aspects that all of us feel, whether or not we know someone who's suffering from the disease.
And also trying to change the way the criminal justice system approaches the problem, because right now it seems like the only sure way of getting treatment is to go to jail.
Correct, and actually there isn't treatment in jail. So, so you can get medically assisted treatment. That bill just passed the legislature in prison, but in terms of actual treatment, learning how to build up your self-worth, learning how to survive in our society again or exist in our society again after you've really lost everything. Many people suffering from the disease have lost everything. That's all part of healing. And there are pieces of our criminal, there is, however, in Greenfield, they're doing currently, they do have treatment in jail, and it is very effective. So that's another piece we can look at. But there's pieces of our criminal justice system that parts of our state have access to and other parts of our state don't, like treatment courts. And there is a vast difference between what happens here in the Windham County Courthouse and what happens in Barry and Burlington in the treatment courts. So I think one thing that we can do, and I know that, for example, our state's attorney here has asked for treatment courts to be added. And so I think one thing we can do is make sure there's treatment court in every county.
And the other things that can be done, that it seemed like when your nephew was going through his treatment, there was a point where he almost was ready to turn the corner, and then he slipped again.
So my nephew had been sober for a year. He had gone to long-term treatment in Minnesota. There is no long-term treatment currently in this state. So he'd gone to long-term treatment in Minnesota. He had gone to a strict step-down program and then another step-down, and he had a full-time job. He was making a good living, and he was very happy. He came back here to address a warrant for one day, to address a warrant that he received for missing a court date while he was in treatment. Which, by the way, if you're in prison and you miss a court date, you do not receive a warrant for that. So we need to address, that is one issue that I wasn't aware of prior and that needs to be addressed within our system. And it's a fairly simple one to address. He went into a shame spiral while in court that day because he was shamed by the prosecutor and the judge. And instead of what I think should have happened, which is praised for almost a year of sobriety, weekly clean drug tests, and really getting his life together and embracing a support system. And he had, within his mental illness, some issues with shame. And so he went into this shame spiral, and we don't know whether he used one time or he picked up while he was in Vermont, and that was the turning point for him. But we did see his demeanor change, and he died, I believe, 2 weeks later. And what I know is that when I see the treatment courts and I see how they operate and I see the compassion with which people suffering from this disease are treated, that there's a huge shift in the outcome. Because when people know that they are loved and that they are capable of love, then they have the strength to get through that a little bit more.
Turning to other issues that your campaign has been big on, certainly the economy and the way it works in Vermont. I mean, we know that particularly here in Windham County, that our per capita income lags behind the rest of the state and lags behind our neighbors in Cheshire County, in New Hampshire, and Franklin County in Massachusetts. And we're really struggling to try and create new jobs and new ideas and ways to boost income.
Yes, so I think as many here in Brattleboro know, I run the Southern Vermont Dance Festival, which was designed as an economic driver following Tropical Storm Irene. And the idea was not so that people would come for 4 days in the summer. The idea it was so that people would come and shop in our stores and eat in our restaurants and come back throughout the year, and some move here. And all of those things have happened. We're in our 6th year. 3,000 to 5,000 people have come every year and shopped in our stores and restaurants. And many have come back throughout the year to visit, and some have even moved. And so I think when we utilize the resources that already exist in our state, in our area. It's the arts, it's recreation, it's farms, and we connect those to businesses and our government, then we begin to see us lifting from the bottom and really building an economy that works for all of us. And also, some of the policies that passed this year that I worked very hard on with Rights and Democracy and the Raise the Wage Coalition, the paid family and medical leave and the $15 an hour minimum wage. What we know is that if people don't have enough money in their pockets to spend in our stores and restaurants, the people that live here, then they won't do that. And so we need to make sure we're creating the tools where people can build what they have to spend and our statewide tax base. So it's not just our local communities, but our statewide tax base is hurt by us not solving this problem. The same is true for homelessness.
Now, I guess the issues that kind of overshadow the good aspects of the Vermont economy, that the homelessness and the opioid crisis is one side of the coin.
Right.
But you also see that, contrary to the drumbeat of young people fleeing Vermont, we see them coming back to start families and start businesses.
I think that I was born and raised here. When you stay in Vermont and you come to Vermont because of Vermont, because it's beautiful here, because we love what's happening here. And what we have to do is create policies and sign good laws instead of vetoing them that encourage young families to come here. We have to do things, we have to support and promote our public schools instead of undermine our public schools. So we need to work very hard. I mean, families want to come here. So we have to make the changes that invite them here. And I think Phil Scott talks about young families coming a lot, but doesn't actually address what they need once they get here.
Well, that's kind of the dichotomy of, you look at all the indicators for education, public safety, quality of life in Vermont's always at the top or near the top of the list. But you look at the business indicators, and Vermont always gets ranked at the bottom of the list.
Right, right, and the other piece is really the dream that something like Amazon will come to our state. That isn't going to happen, and frankly, I don't really want that to happen. I think most Vermonters, that's not really what they want. They want to see our small businesses thriving, and our farms thriving, and our arts and our recreation thriving. That's what I think most Vermonters want to see. And so, when you utilize the resources that exist in the state, that's when you begin to see those aspects thriving. And I think the trend in the last 2 years to protect big business rather than really support the everyday people in this state has been unfortunate for our long-term economy. Because we often look at the economy and we say, I want to do what's going to fix something for right now or 3 years from now. But we ought to be looking at the economy. So yes, we want to be improving right now, but we should be looking at it for what is it going to do for our state, for our children, for our grandchildren in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years, and making our policies that last.
That comes back to another thing that brings people to Vermont or young families back to Vermont, and that's education. And I know Act 46 is a hot topic in Windham County,
yes,
and other parts of the state, and people really, really care about their schools and the identity that schools bring to their towns.
Well, and not only that, schools are the economic center of those towns. So if we lose the small schools, then we're going to also have troubles with the economy in those towns. I think we can both support and promote our public schools. This is certainly not a time to underfund public schools, not when there's serious poverty and the opioid epidemic going on in our state. But we can improve upon our schools, of course, doing things like implementing the ethnic studies standard and centralizing services closer to schools. And what that means is that families who need access to those services have easier access to the services. Teachers are then alleviated of that burden to some extent, which then makes sure that all of our kids get a stronger education because teachers are not distracted by that burden. And then in addition, it has the added benefit of some of the funding coming from human services, which helps keep our small schools open. So it's really a win-win.
Well, turning the schools into kind of full service social service. access points for families.
Right. I think that the model is community centers, but I don't think we're ready to go all the way there yet in Vermont. I think we should start with one thing. So start with human services, so social services. But I think ultimately our schools are these buildings, in some cases really incredible buildings that we're only using for a certain portion of the day, and we could be utilizing more, and that would be have a cost benefit as well.
Well, from adult education to
right.
to other things.
To performances and activities.
Yes.
So yes, I think there's a huge benefit to that. And in addition, I think we can look at the way school is funded. I don't think that it shouldn't be underfund education to lower our property taxes or fully fund education and higher our property taxes. We should look at a creative way for funding and make sure that we're talking about that. But I want to add as a caveat to that Phil Scott's plan, where he said that he was going to save everybody's property taxes, 50% of our towns saw a property tax increase this year. Their property tax bill increased this year, despite what he said. And those are the towns where they have the most struggling population. They are being penalized because they have more school spending because they have a population that's more difficult to contend with. And in years 3, 4, and 5, if we follow his plan, so if we do not vote him out, in years 3, 4, and 5, all of us will see a property tax increase. So it's disingenuous of him to say that what he's doing is saving Vermonters money, because in fact, his plan ends up with us paying more in years 3, 4, and 5, which will give us sticker shock. And then the hope is we will vote down our education budgets, and that will undermine our public schools, and he will have the platform then to move to a voucher system. And so it's really important that we're clear about what's actually happening here with education in this state. It's not just a national trend.
That those national trends are sneaking their way into Vermont.
Right, exactly.
And how do you counter that, especially this governor who seems to be taking some pages from the playbooks of some of the more conservative governors in the Midwest, like Scott Walker in Wisconsin, or folks like him.
Right. I think that we need to do a better job on the left of talking about what is really happening and laying out the outline. So I believe everything we've talked about today, I believe there's a moral imperative for it. However, I accept that not everyone believes with me that there's a moral imperative for these issues. What I think it's really important for Vermonters to understand is that there's an economic imperative to solving these problems. Because when we solve them, we actually save the state money. And in fact, in some cases, we will gain revenue from it. And so in order for our economy to grow, we do have to solve these problems. It's not just a moral imperative, it's also an economic imperative.
Well, that's like spending on early education and
right.
Saving money in the long run by intervening and helping kids grow up to be healthy and strong.
Exactly, and I also think that that when if I'm fortunate enough to go against Phil Scott in the general election, I think he's going to have a really hard time going toe to toe with me. One of the things he promised was to protect the most vulnerable. The bills that he vetoed this year are bills that would have helped my family and many families all around Vermont. He's going to have a hard time with that message. He will not. I don't think he will be able to defend those vetoes with me going toe to toe with him. I also think it's going to really take someone who understands intimately what he's been doing for the last 2 years and understands why he's been doing it. And I think that is I think that we have a very good chance at beating him, because he has lost a lot of popularity over the last year, especially.
Although for the kind of wrong reason, since
right.
the main reason why he's dropped in popularity is signing the firearms legislation earlier this year.
Yes, and he had some balance out there because some some Democrats were really happy with that move, but then I'm going to say he messed that up, because with the budget debacle, he really made some big mistakes and he lost some of his support there as well. And I think what we've seen over the last two years is that we have a governor that doesn't negotiate with teachers unions, that doesn't negotiate with the state employees union, that doesn't negotiate with the legislature. He has a my way or the highway attitude, and it's very dictatorial. And that's not what we know in Vermont at all. We know that we can work together and create good, strong legislation that moves this state and this country forward.
So how do you get that message across, and how do you go against, say, the tradition where there hasn't been a one-term governor in 52 years?
And I think part of the reason for that,
since 1962.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that has happened is because we believe that there can't be a one-term governor. So people don't come in and really fight for it in the way that they have in other years. We have Vermonters who don't engage because that's what they believe. And so we can change the system, and right now we have an unpopular governor. So it is not at all is not in our imagination that it's something that we can change. I think all we have to do is get in there and fight for what Vermonters, what people in this state need and want, and be very clear about our message with a strong platform going forward. And I think it is essential, though, that we understand what he's been doing, and it's essential that we're able to counter that message. That is how we win.
Well, I guess that requires a leap of imagination, and I think that's probably could be a good description for your campaign, because this person from Vermont, from Newfane, who's never run for public office and is best known for running a dance festival, is all of a sudden in the mix for governor of the state of Vermont. Well,
so to be clear, my position in the dance festival is in executive leadership.
Yes.
So it's not the stretch that I think a lot of people think of dance, and they just think that I don't know, pas de bourrée down the street or something. But I'm actually running a dance festival. So I'm creating all the executive leadership. 3,000 to 5,000 people come because of my leadership, and the team that I've picked to work with me to make sure that it happens every year. And also, the trend we're seeing across the country right now is that people are jumping into leadership, community organizers, political activists, and they're winning. And none of my opponents have run for political office in the past, and I have a different kind of leadership, but just as much level of leadership as both of them do. I think what my history is putting forth a vision, finding the right people to create that vision with me, and then making it happen. And that I've had a successful adult history of making sure that happens.
Well, that sounds like a lot to try and accomplish on the first try, but it's certainly in a volatile election year, could happen.
Yeah, and one of us is going to have to win, and none of us have ever run before. So there's no reason. I'm the one that has the most experience being in the State House and the deepest understanding of what goes on in our legislature. And so actually the strongest ability to beat Phil Scott.
So say in 60 seconds or less, or maybe a little bit more, what would be the one point that you would ask voters to remember when they're considering choosing between you and your three opponents?
Well, what we've seen over the last 20 years, our whole history has been that we pick leaders from a certain funnel, either from the legislature or as CEOs of companies. We do not, and what I know is that the strongest leaders I know are community organizers, are people who come from similar backgrounds as mine or different backgrounds, and it is time for us to redefine leadership. Executive leadership comes in many different forms, and what we want is someone who is the bravery, the courage, the political courage, and the understanding of our political system to make sure that we are going to push popular, progressive movements forward. And we need, in order to do that, we need someone who understands vision and leadership and who is not afraid of a challenge.
And you're that person.
I am turned every negative thing that's happened to me in my life, I have turned into some kind of action. And I think it's time that we have that kind of person as our leader.
Well, Brenda, good luck in the campaign. Please go, if you remember, August 14th.
August 14th,
And early voting has begun.
And brendaforvermont.com is how you learn more about me, and it's all spelled out.
All right. And make sure you go out to vote, and thank you very much, and have a pleasant day.